Hello, and welcome to Badger Talks Quick Picks, which brings exciting happenings, resources, and talent from your UW flagship campus to the people of Wisconsin and beyond. My name is Nora Schlenker, and I am a PhD student in the Department of Geography here at UW-Madison. I am pleased to introduce Dr. Jack Williams, professor in geography and a former director of the Center for Climatic Research at UW-Madison. Today, he will discuss how we are currently experiencing climate changes without precedent in human history. How can we help species and ecosystems adapt? Scientists like Jack Williams study ecological responses to past climate change to understand the sensitivity and adaptability of species to changing environments. Lakes, with their steadily accumulating sediments, are natural archives for studying local scale ecological and environmental dynamics over thousands of years. Now, with tens of thousands of these records available worldwide, we can study ecological responses to past large and abrupt climate change at global scales, and thereby design solutions to help species adapt to current climate changes. Jack Williams studies ecological responses to changing climates using the end of the last ice age as a model system for understanding the effects of large global rises in temperature. His work ranges from fieldwork and coring lakes to helping lead and build global-scale community databases. He has lived in Wisconsin since 2004 and has raised his family here. He enjoys kayaking, pickleball, running with his dog, and board gaming. Dr. Williams is a fellow of the Ecological Society of America and a Kellett Fellow at UW-Madison. Please welcome Dr. Jack Williams.
Okay, so what I'm going to talk about today is kind of going from small to big, how we can go from individual lakes like you see here. This is a beautiful little Kettle Lake, actually the one where Nora did much of part of her dissertation, Story Lake in northern Indiana. You can see a team there retrieving lake sediment core using a hand-driven system, retrieving mud from the bottom of the lake. And then you can see that tube of mud there, which is a couple inches diameter and about 3 feet long. That represents about 1,000 years of history. Each of those little lines, maybe you can see there, might be about a few years to a decade in sort of time to deposit that mud. So, why do this? Why study the past? Why go to lakes and retrieve sediment cores? Well, one of the big societal challenges we're all facing now is climate change, of course, and we're seeing it in our really warm springs we've had this year and in past years. And globally, we know that temperatures have risen by about 1 degree Celsius, maybe 2 degrees Fahrenheit, just over the last 100 years. We're already seeing more climate change in our generation than likely any generation has seen before us. And one of the questions we all want to know is how will that affect the landscapes and ecosystems around us? The pines and spruces of northern Wisconsin, the oak savannas, the areas characterized by snow and ice. How will these systems respond to a warming world? Well, this is not the first time the world has warmed. And in fact, we know that the climate system of the Earth has changed many times over geological history. What we're looking at here is a record of global temperature change from the last 60 million years ago at left, all the way into the future, the 2100s, 2200s at right. And the vertical axis is change in temperature. So positive would be warmer than present being kind of late 20th century, kind of present as a geologist would call it. And then negative would be colder than present. And so you can then see the horizontal axis is sort of going from longer time scales, tens of millions of years to millions of years, to hundreds of thousands of years, the last 20,000 years, and then into the 20th century, where we have an actual instrumental record. That's the black line there, and then off into the future. And so this period that we have, the 19th and 20th century, where we actually have instrumental data, that's just a very small time window here. And it's a period where not much has happened climatically. That previous slide I showed you, 1 degree temperature change is a big deal, but it's small compared to the climate changes of the past and those expected over the coming decades. And of course, this is why we're so concerned that there's more to come. Well, we can see that in the past, there's been some big things happening. There's been a global cooling over the last 60 million years when we had crocodiles in Greenland and incredibly warm greenhouse climates of the Eocene. And then the time period that I study, you can see these regular oscillations, these ice ages, brief warm periods, long cool periods, brief warm, long cool. And that's these temperature swings on the order of about 5 or 6 degrees Celsius in 9 or 10 Fahrenheit that are the same kind of magnitude of the temperature swings we are expecting over the coming century as we keep putting more greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, unless we can move away from doing so. And so we can use the past and the end of the last ice age, and now this time period here over the last sort of 20,000 years ago to 10,000 years ago becomes kind of a natural analog for the climate changes of the future. And so this is the time period that many of my colleagues and I study as a way of understanding how species respond to changing climates. So lakes are kind of wonderful, wonderful archives. They collect everything that kind of washes into them. Things settle down to the bottom of the lake. If you ever lost something overboard when fishing, when that's down in the sediment column too, most of what settles down there is just quiet water, little bits of organic particles and small mud flecks that build up slowly over time, maybe a centimeter of mud, a couple of inches of mud every decade or so. We can go out and pour those lake sediments, as you saw in the opening slide. We can retrieve them, we can wrap them carefully, and then we can do all kinds of analyses to look at the ecosystems and environments in and around that lake over its entire history. 15,000 years if you're a glacial kettle lake around here, hundreds of thousands of years if you're a Rift Valley lake in East Africa. And so many different kinds of measurements can be made. And the ones I'm going to focus on the most here is pollen, but then to look at past ecological and vegetation history. And the pollen that winds up in these lakes is being blown in from the surrounding trees, those that rely upon wind dispersal. The pollen falls on the lake, falls down through the water column, and then is captured in the mud. Now, people have been doing lake sediment cores and pollen analysis and radiocarbon dates and all kinds of other things for decades now, and in fact, over a century in the case of some of these different approaches. And as a result of that, we now have dozens to hundreds of records from around North America and around the world. And you can see here just a map of every triangle there represents a lake or a bog where someone has done one of these lake sediment cores. And then you can see a few stars to recommend individual sites that I often highlight in individual talks. I won't have quite as much time today, but Devil's Lake, for example, one of the iconic sites in southern Wisconsin, is one of these places where we have one of these long 15,000 year records. So, okay, so lots of people have been doing this, but this is time intensive work, right? Each lake takes a few weeks of maybe a few days, a few weeks of field work. Then there's the effort to analyze the data and work at a microscope and write it up for a paper. Usually it takes us maybe 2 to 3 years from first field collection to publishing the paper. It's labor intensive work, and it's the heroic work of people like Nora that get this kind of science done. But what we want to do is go from many individual records that tell us about things happening at one locality to global perspectives on past vegetation change, biodiversity dynamics, and how ecosystems respond globally to global climate change. And so then this moves from being a scientific challenge to an informatics challenge and a data science challenge. How do we build big databases that let us look at global scale ecological dynamics from these many individual sites? The challenges we face, well, first off, it's long tail data, hard-won data collected by many teams, each collecting a few records individually. Each one of us, we have geochemists and micropaleontologists and geochronologists. Each scientist is a specialist in a different kind of measurement system, and we all do our things our own way. And we're always evolving our methods over time too, as we get better and better at the science we do. So that creates a lot of variety and heterogeneity in our data. And then we're just distributed communities. We work around the world. Different peoples work in different measurement systems. They work in different parts of the geological time scale, different taxonomic groups. So it's kind of hard to get us together. The classic example of herding cats really applies when you're working with scientists trying to get us together to collect and organize the data. We might all agree it's a good idea, but still getting it done is a non-trivial challenge. And at the bottom there, you can see some different ways in which we collect our data. Ocean drilling campaigns, small lakes like I showed you above, and then people at outcrops, hammering at outcrops. That is not a safety recommended pose there at the bottom right, by the way. Okay, so that's the challenges. But then the good news is that we are doing the same kind of thing. We're working down some kind of stratigraphic column from youngest sediments at top to oldest sediments at bottom. So we have some kind of depth scale. We're making different measurements as we go down depth, farther and farther back in time. And then we have some kind of geochronology, some kind of radiocarbon dates or argon dates or other ways of inferring how far back in time we are at different positions in the stratigraphic column. So that's kind of a common structure that all of our data, regardless of how we measure our specific thing, all organize itself into. Also, our community recognizes that the data we collect has a very long shelf life. We keep reusing these measurements because each one is kind of unique and irreplaceable measurement of the Earth life system at some point in time. So the community recognizes this, and we see value in sharing and storing our data. So what's emerged then is kind of the grassroots solutions. So how do we do this? How do we organize ourselves? It was what I would call these community curated or expert curated data resources. And they have a combination of kind of a social element and an institutional element, and then a data element. We have a common mission of scientists banding together to study questions like global climate change and species responses to global climate change. They tend to be scientists kind of working together, and there's been emergent systems for how do we govern our data? Who decides what data is added or changed or modified, under what rules or protocols? So there's these governance systems that emerge with that. And then on the technical side, we usually have some kind of back-end database of some kind where the data is stored and archived. We have ways of making it open and available to others through different kinds of software and outlets, usually through some kind of web-based platform. And then there's some way of uploading and curating the data. So we can add data in, we can correct errors if they're caught, we can update the data if new models are built for better inference. So there's ways we kind of modify and improve the inferences over time. And that this data allows us to kind of go from many small individual sites, each on its own, to some kind of maybe not quite big data, but kind of medium scale data or mesoscale data where we have networks of sites all around the world. And this kind of structure that I'm describing to you is kind of an emergent outcome that's happened lots of places in the earth and environmental sciences. I'll be talking more about one resource, Neotoma, but the Paleobiology Database, Linked Earth, Ameriflux, these are other coalitions of other scientists who are doing the exact same kind of thing. They gather their many individual sites into something larger. So then the resource that I have helped lead and have been the most involved with is called the Neotoma Paleoecology Database. And now you're seeing a lot of dots on the map, and each dot is a lake or a bog or something like that, where some team of scientists have gone out and taken those sediment cores. They've gone back to the lab and done the microscope work or geochemical analyses. They've worked on some record of vegetation history or climate history or fire history or whatever it is, human history, all with the goal of understanding past ecological change, past climate change, past human dynamics, and how they're all connecting to each other. This data then is free for all to use. It's open data for other scientists, for the public at large. It's curated by experts, making this data high value. So there's some common standards that these data follow, such as defined vocabularies. We start to agree on common terms to describe our data. In some ways, this is the most important and often the most contested. Getting scientists to agree on words can be a long-running process sometimes to make sure we're all saying the same things, same words about the same things. And so here's an example of what you can get when you do this. So one of the key lessons that comes from bringing this kind of data is what I would say, when climates change, species move. And so we're going to see here in an animation, start in just a moment. And we're looking at North America starting 20,000 years ago. You might be able to see that the little time marker up here is negative 21,000 years. So that's 21,000 years ago in the past. The light blue is the former ice sheet that covered Canada and Wisconsin, or most of Wisconsin and much of the northern US. And then each of these circles here represents a site, a lake or a bog or something like that, where we've done the fossil pollen or somebody has done the fossil pollen. And then the colors are the different plant taxa and the abundance of those plant taxa. So you might see there's lots of oak here, that kind of reddish color, lots of spruce trees in South Carolina here 20,000 years ago. It was colder back then with ice in Canada, and then spruce trees living down in the southeastern coastal plain. So it's a different world back then. And what we're going to see as we press the animation now, that we're going to see basically this is a global warming of about 6 degrees Celsius or about 11 degrees Fahrenheit. That's the warming that ended the last ice age, caused all the ice to melt away. So you're seeing the blue retreat back. And now the colors are showing you from all these many sites around of these different lakes and bogs and the pollen from these lakes and bogs, the key story that when climates change, species move. And I'm just going to go ahead and rewind that back a little bit here, because you can see that blue, it's spruce, is expanding northwards into places vacated by ice. Oak is starting to expand northwards into places vacated by spruce. You might see, sedges, tundra off in the eastern Canada. There's lots of things going on here, and there's more than you can be sort of shown in a single viewing. So if you want to play with it yourself, you can go to geography.wisc.edu/rangemapper to play with this. This is an interactive map you can explore, but you can really see that this highly mobile response the world is warming at the end of the last ice age, the ice is melting, and then different tree taxa are migrating northward, meaning that they're dying out. Spruce is dying out in the southeastern Atlantic coastal plain. It's expanding into areas vacated by ice, and then other taxa are expanding northwards, each driven by changing climates. And so we can see a very strong sensitivity of species and ecosystems to climates as climates change and as temperatures rise. This kind of information is really important for helping inform current policy. We can expect that as the world warms today, we should see similar kinds of dynamics, species moving northwards or otherwise responding to changing environments. So then, okay, that's great. And those kind of animations are fun to kind of show these kind of dynamics. But, that visualization was really designed for kind of a public audience for this kind of presentation to get across clearly these kind of movements of different tree taxa. We can also use this as sort of, scientists to ask questions not well answered before. Here's a series of results showing the rates of global vegetation change over the last 18,000 years. So the axis here is 18,000 years ago. Ka means thousand, kilo annum, thousands of years. So we're going from 18,000 years ago to 0. That would be present, 0 years ago. And then the vertical axis, it's a rate of change metric. Higher numbers mean faster rates of change in these plant communities, meaning community turnover. Spruce is getting replaced by oaks and all the rest of that. And if you look at these different continents, each of these different curves are from, the 6 panels here from 6 different continents here. The details vary, but often what you see is that there's 2 peak periods of rates of change. One is around kind of 14 to 12,000 years ago. That's the end of the last ice age. That's the animations I was sort of showing you when the world is warming and ice is melting and plant taxa are shifting their ranges. Lots of things are happening then. But you can see another period of high rates of change is the recent past, the last couple thousand years. And this is probably a combination of both, there is some climate change happening now too, but also this starts a couple thousand years ago, maybe 2,000 years ago or so. This is probably also a signal of early human activity, or early indigenous societies, early Bronze Age civilizations in different parts of the world, modifying environments, and that we can now see that these rates of ecological change around us now are as fast or as faster as those transformative changes we saw at the end of the last ice age. This is another paper, and again, these are all using these lake sediment records, bringing them together into these kind of global analyses here. So we're going from one site to thousands of sites around the world. This is another study looking at the islands of the world and the rates of vegetation change. That's the blue line. So 5,000 years ago to present on the horizontal axis. And then each island has an orange line marked on it. That's the timing of human arrival, when we think humans arrive based upon archaeological evidence. And we can see at many of these islands, there's an inflection point where there's some kind of background change and things happening. But then when humans arrive, things really change. And so we can start to see that on island after island around the world, the arrival of humans is transformative for these ecosystems. And we can really see that this is an important event. Not just fossil fuels and all the things we worry about today, but just early humans, early societies around the world have had these transformative effects upon these island ecosystems. And the whole point too of these open scientific data resources is not just to do great science, although we hope that can happen and advance our knowledge of the world around us, but also to train the next generation of scientists. So often now, access to data becomes a critical barrier to career advancement. Knowing how to use the data is another barrier to career advancement. So creating these open data resources and then training scientists on how to use these open data resources becomes a new way to advance the field of scientists by training the scientists of tomorrow. This is one effort led by Sarah Ivory. She's a member of the Neotoma Paleoecology Database, working with partners in the African Pollen Database, scientists from around the world, in Africa, in Europe, in the US, to help train and advance the next generation of scientists. So just kind of summarize kind of the big points here. We really are in a period of remarkable climate change. We have to go back to the deep geologic past to find counterparts for what's happening around us right now. Sometimes it's all too easy to lose sight of the big picture, but it's really a transformative world we're in the midst of right now. And so we can go to the past for understanding how species have adapted to big, large, novel climates. One of the things we can see, as Range Mapper showed, is that when climates change, species move. Even trees, they're rooted in place, but their seeds will set up the forests of tomorrow. That is something we should expect changing around us now. Open data resources like Neotoma can then advance this next generation of global research by providing this open, high quality, community created resource that's available to everybody. And then really what you can see is that once this happens, lots of good things happen. I've only given you sort of a tip of the iceberg kind of summary, lots of other kind of scientific papers and initiatives that kind of start to build upon these open data resources and software. And just to close, I want to really emphasize that I'm presenting as one person, but I'm representing the work of many. There's a large group of people that are sort of working with the both building the data systems and contributing data and organizing the community. So there's lots of people involved here. And then we've had support from the National Science Foundation, UW-Madison, Belmont Forum, and others. And so there's lots of people and partners to thank. Too many logos to summarize in the time here. So lots of people involved in this effort. And I'd like to also thank you for your time and attention.